Well, good morning and welcome to Tylecombe Church. This is actually take two. I tried to do a take in the garden earlier on today, but the background noise was too great, which sort of illustrates the problem that we're going to be looking at this morning. I guess for many of us, life is full of noise. There's noise in our homes, there's noise in our cars, there's noise in our gardens. I sometimes feel that summer is a time when I have to get to learn to like my neighbour's taste in music. But it doesn't stop there. There's the beep on our phone that tells us not just that we've got a phone call coming in, but there's a new social media message, there's a new WhatsApp message, there's a new email coming in. When I started work, I used to get maybe 4 or 5 memos a day, a couple of letters, the odd phone call. By the time I finished, I was getting 60 emails a day. And all of this just constitutes some of the distraction and the pressure that exists in our world. It's the background noise that we live with the whole time. I caught an item on the news the other day that said that the Scottish restaurant owners were complaining bitterly that the ban on background music in their restaurants was damaging their trade, because we sort of somehow seem to need this background noise the whole time. Now, before I get labelled as a grumpy old man, at which point you say you already are, let me point out that this has happened all the way through history. It just changes with particular generations. And Jesus was no stranger to this sort of pressure and distraction. Right at the start of his ministry, we find him heading out into what's described as the wilderness, where Matthew tells us he was fasting. So this is obviously a time of preparation for his ministry. But while he's there, the devil comes along and the devil tempts him, and most of those temptations are about diverting him from the central course of what he's come to do. So here is Jesus starting to carve out time to prepare himself, but having to do battle with the devil. And the wilderness is often a place of preparation and of being there and of being serious with God and about what God is doing. And it's a pattern which happens again and again in Jesus' ministry. So we fast forward a few days and we find him in Capernaum. Now, it's been a busy day. People have been coming to listen to him. People have been coming, bringing people who want healing. And Jesus has been busy. He's been meeting people, he's been meeting human needs. And that's gone on right into the evening. So let's pick up the story in Mark chapter 1 and verse 35. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Simon and his companions went to look for him, and when they found him, they exclaimed, "Everyone is looking for you." Jesus replied, "Let us go somewhere else, to the nearby villages, so that I can preach there also. That is why I have come." So he travelled throughout Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and driving out demons. So Jesus, after the pressure of the day, needs to get up early and go and carve out some time to spend time with his Father, to recharge the batteries, to renew himself for the day ahead. And then he also needs to withdraw from this particular place because of the pressures that are there. Luke, in his account of the story, tells us that the people tried to stop him leaving. They wanted to set his agenda, but Jesus won't have that. He has to set the agenda, and he needs time and space to pursue his work, his kingdom work, in the way that the Father has determined. So off he goes, and this becomes a regular pattern in Jesus' life. In Luke chapter 5 and verse 15, we're told that the news about him spread all the more, so that crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sickness. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Now, wilderness here may conjure up perhaps slightly the wrong image in our minds. This is not a desert place, it's a lonely place, it's a solitary place. Jesus is in Galilee, which is more sort of rolling hills than desert. Yeah, it can get pretty dry sometimes, but it's not sort of desert or wilderness as we normally think of it. The key point here is that Jesus finds a place where he can be alone, and he can be alone with the Father, and he can pray, and he can recharge himself, and he can focus on what he has been called to do. And that's why it's important to just sort of take these sorts of times out. Now, we have to be careful here. I've suggested that most of this pressure, this noise and this distraction comes from the world around us. And it very often does. But it's not only from there. Sometimes even very good things can create this sort of distraction and noise. Sometimes even being involved in Christian work can have that sort of effect. So we need to be careful. Many of us will know the story of Mary and Martha, two sisters living in Bethany, a village just outside Jerusalem, and Jesus has come to stay. And Martha is busy preparing a meal for Jesus. Now, what could be better than that? Meanwhile, Mary is just sitting with Jesus and probably with the other disciples. She's listening to him, drinking in what he says. So it's hardly surprising that Martha gets a bit frustrated with this and comes along to Jesus and says, "Look, what's going on here? Tell her to come and give me a hand in the kitchen." And Jesus has to say to Martha, "Look, that's actually not the best choice right now. The choice that Mary has made, that's the best choice for right now. Spending time with me, listening to me, and learning from me." So we have to be careful with that. And if this is the repeated pattern of Jesus' life, then we need to learn from that. If he needed to carve out time to spend time with the Father, then, quite frankly, so do we. So how do we do that? Well, the first thing we do is that we find our solitary place. It may not mean getting our shoes and coat on and heading off to a far corner of Galleywood Common or Blake's Wood, although that may help. Many years ago, I remember being at a conference where Phil Yancey was doing the Bible teaching, and one evening he just told us some of the stories which would later appear in his book, What's So Amazing About Grace. And at the end of it, we were just blown away with this sense of God's love and God's goodness. We were supposed to go off to small discussion groups, and we got to our discussion group and we just said, you know what, this isn't what we need right now. We just need to spend a bit of time letting this sink in. And I went off to a little beach near the conference centre and just sat on the beach for a couple of hours with the moon over the waves, reflecting on the immensity, not just of the ocean, but of God's love for us as his people. But it may be something quite simple, like a room in the house. After all, Jesus in Matthew chapter 6 says, when you pray, go into your room and close the door. Or it may even just be a special chair that we associate with prayer. Or we may have a cabin in the garden. Or it may even be the car. I mean, for me, for many years when I was driving across the Milton Keynes every day, it was the car. I would listen to the news for a little bit, then I would turn the news off, I listened to a bit of Bible on the tape, and then I would spend the rest of the journey praying. So there are many places that we can use which actually enable us just to be on our own. The key thing is not the place, it's the fact that we have just carved out a little bit of space that's just between us and our Father. What do we do when we get to this place, whatever it is or wherever it is? Well, for Jesus, the emphasis seems to be on prayer, which of course is fine. Except that if we're honest, all of us find prayer immensely difficult. As soon as we start to pray, our mind wanders off elsewhere, and all those distractions just sort of come in. So we may need to do something which helps us to shape that time. And there are plenty of things that can help us. Obviously, the Bible can help us, and perhaps some system of daily Bible reading guide can help us. Many of us use something like that. It may be a book or a podcast. Many of us find music is very helpful just to help us focus our mind. Some of us like things that are visual, a picture, maybe a candle. There are lots of things that can just help us to focus and keep our concentration, and they're all worth doing. But here's a second trap. If we're not careful, those things can take over and can become an end in themselves rather than a means to an end. And that can be a real danger along the way. So perhaps sometimes you might want to change what you do just to explore something else and make sure that the things that you find very helpful aren't actually taking over from the main purpose. So we come, we focus on God, we pray, we listen, being quiet is very important here. Listening is part of this. It's not just us making a noise, it's that ability to allow God to speak into our lives. American poet T.S. Eliot became a Christian in his later life, and some of his later poetry reflects his Christian experience. He has a memorable phrase in one of his poems. He talks about the still point of the turning earth. Now, Eliot is not the easiest poet to understand, and I'm not entirely sure that I know what he meant by that phrase, but I like the idea that somewhere in this world as it turns, with all its busyness, its hustle, its bustle, its noise, its distractions, there's a still point. And for us, as followers of the King, that still point is found in his presence. And as we come into the presence of Jesus, in the presence of his Father and our Father, so we find a stillness which can affect not only us, but can affect those around us as well. And it's perhaps worth at this point saying, of course, that we come as we are. There's no point in pretending to be anything that we're not. We simply come as failed, broken human beings, because God knows what we're like anyway. But we may find, of course, that we come as we are, but that process of being with him, of challenging the distractions and the noise of the world, begins to bring change into our lives. Let me close with Eugene Peterson's version in the Message of Matthew chapter 6, verses 6 and 7. Here's what I want you to do. Find a quiet, secluded place so you won't be tempted to role play before God. Just be there as simply and honestly as you can manage. The focus will shift from you to God, and you will begin to sense his grace. If there's anything you've heard this morning you'd like to explore a little bit more, if you are new to some of this, then you can contact us through our webpage or our Facebook page, and the details are coming up.